Yeah, thank you for coming to this talk today on interactivity and virtual reality. So what I'm going to go through today is just looking back at 2016 to just kind of show what VR brought in terms of hardware and experiences and that kind of thing. And then condensing that down and looking at what that taught our developer base about interactivity. And that's going to be split into 3 areas, so visuals, audio, and input. And then finally, we're going to look at what the future of interactivity may be. So this talk is completely code-free. It's not technical. It's just overarching principles that myself and fellow evangelists have found the development community have been adopting for virtual reality. So whether you're a programmer, designer, audio, there'll be something in here for you that you can take away. So just a little bit about me. I'm an educational evangelist at Unity. So I engage with new adopters of Unity, also educational institutions, to give people the best tools to be making experiences, and it's a super cool job. So it's really cool to be here. But also, I only graduated last year. I'm a very recent graduate, and my research focus was in virtual reality and interactivity. So there's a little bit of a personal slant on this too. So yes. So 2016 was dubbed the year of virtual reality, and that's mainly because it was sort of the big consumer release of virtual reality. So we had PSVR in our homes and the Vive, and mobile adoption of virtual reality was bigger than ever. It became super accessible. So the type of platforms. So first of all, we've got the mobile side of things like our Gear VRs, also like our Google Cardboard. So these are super accessible. Anybody can get hold of these and pop their phone in there. And also usually the hardware, the headsets and the experiences are either free or super cheap. So that it's accessible to the masses. On the other side of that, we have, I've called it tethered. So looking at more your Oculus, your Vives, your PlayStation VRs, which usually need expensive, highly tuned hardware to run the experiences, but actually they have a higher level of interaction and processing power, which arguably makes for more believable, realistic, high-fidelity experiences. So we've got this kind of 2 ends of the spectrum in virtual reality at the moment. So in terms of the interactivity of these experiences, we have like a one-button system. So I don't know if any of you have used the Gear VRs or the Google Cardboards where you've just got a button at the side. Very simple interactions and can be used across all of the VR devices regardless of sort of the fidelity of them. Going on from that, we have hand tracking. So here I'm talking about the Oculus Touch controllers and the Vive controllers and that kind of thing. So we're getting that step further into getting gestures and that higher level of immersion. And then one step further, which is more thinking of the cost and the fidelity of the experience, there's also the idea of space. So again, you have that sort of higher level of experience because you have that spatial awareness of it when using virtual reality. But then it's another consideration of, can I fit this in my living room? So there's a lot of that VR has offered, but that's also brought with it quite a lot of considerations and challenges. So as I said earlier, myself and other evangelists at the end of last year, still beginning of this year, decided to do a bit of a roundup of what the development community were doing, what was working, and seeing what was out there. And this is the climate that we got for virtual reality as it stands. So, and this slide is it seems so negative, but it's not, bear with me. But we found that there's no market for it yet. When we hear the facts and figures of sort of there's 100,000 Vive owners within the first 3 months, there's 900,000 PlayStation VR units out there, it's fantastic. But if we compare that to, say, the console market that's established, and this may seem a bit unfair, but if we look at, for example, there's like 40 million PlayStation 4 units worldwide, but only 900,000 PSVR units sold. That's like 2% of the market. Similarly with mobile, which is more accessible, there's like 5 million Gear VRs that were sold, But the percentage, there's only about 2 million active apps that are actually sort of currently being used. So the market is there, and there's a demand for it. It's just the push and sort of identifying how to levy that market. Also, there's no standards, but I don't think this is a bad thing. So virtual reality is very pioneering. It's a new field, and we're finding out new things, such as I'm going to share with you in this talk. And so that means that there is no rule book that's being written, and a lot of people are worried that they're going to have to completely change drastically their development processes that they're used to and have been for a number of years. So again, that's another sort of barrier to entry with virtual reality from the developer's standpoint. And finally, there's no killer application. So again, I'm comparing this to console, which is a little bit unfair, but I mean there's no Halo for PlayStation VR. There's no app that's out there at the moment that is making the masses want to buy a virtual reality headset. And so at the moment, this is the current climate of virtual reality and how it stands. So this talk is about interactivity. So I just wanted to define what that was from Jesse Schell. I love Jesse Schell, he's amazing. So interactivity is the two-way flow of information. So that's between the player and also two-way flow of communication between the player and the computer or the system that you're using. And this interactivity happens through the user interface. That's where this two-way flow of communication happens. And so the interactivity that is as part of the games that we all know and love today, outside of virtual reality, is usually split into 3 parts. So the input from the controllers, whether this is mouse or keyboard or PlayStation, Xbox controllers, that kind of thing. And then the output, the representation that we're getting back, which is usually through audio or the screen. Then we have the simulated game world, that what we're all used to is behind that screen. And then we have this user interface that I've spoken about, that visual representation that can often give some stimulus back to the player of what's going on. And so when all these things work well together, when these things work together, that's called mapping. And when they work well together, this is what creates a really streamlined, smooth user experience, and quite an intuitive one. So when I talk about the user interface, I am talking of there are a lot of games, and as you'll see in virtual reality as well, that don't have a graphical user interface. They don't have any health bars or that kind of thing. But they use other ways to be able to elicit that response back to the player. And I'll discuss a few of those later. So if I look at this idea of mapping between these 2 elements, but adapt them to virtual reality, it's actually a little different. So we still use our input that we're all used to. So we can still use controllers and mouse and keyboard for virtual reality experiences. That's absolutely fine. But now we're inside the virtual reality world. And usually I find that as soon as you put someone in a virtual reality world, they just want to smash the place up, or they just want to look in every nook and cranny. And so there's this added layer of what the player wants and expects. There's so much more demand as a developer to be able to appreciate that and find ways to implement that. And then, as if that isn't enough, there's more complications to deal with. So I've been doing this talk 5 minutes, and I'm already mentioning motion sickness, but it needs to be mentioned. And then there's also the idea of fatigue and session length. So at the moment, the experiences that we have are quite short, and they're usually just very short experiences and quick bursts, apart from Resident Evil, but that's just aggressive in its own way. And then there's also this idea of moving throughout the world, the locomotion. And I would argue that that's still the biggest challenge for a lot of developers. So I'm going to go into a few areas of that too a little later. Another buzzword that you'll usually find used with virtual reality that I just think is really important to iterate in this idea of interactivity is presence. And the key part is that this idea of presence that virtual reality brings, it means that the individual forgets that they're in this computer simulated environment, and they forget that they're getting this output back from a machine, and you feel like you're in just a very high fidelity experience. And I think that interactivity and virtual reality more than ever is what is driving this. So this is why you'll hear presence used a lot. You'll like hear emotive machine, presence, just used quite a lot with virtual reality. So what did we find out? I've sort of given this backstory, but now onto the part that matters, I guess. So as I said, I've split this into 3 parts. The first part is about the visuals and what we learned about the visual side of things with virtual reality. This is Land's End. Has anyone played it? It's really lovely. If any of you have never tried virtual reality before, or you want to give virtual reality to someone to try that they haven't before, then I would totally recommend Land's End. It's so nice. So earlier on I said there's this spectrum of virtual reality where we have these high fidelity experiences but they're expensive, and we have these lower fidelity experiences but they're quite cheap. But what's quite cool to see is that a lot of the platforms will use the same principles in development. And this is all centered around optimization. Because optimization is super important when it comes to maintaining that frame rate, so you're not causing motion sickness. So a lot of the same techniques are used, and a few of these are sort of like pre-calculated effects, so pre-calculated lights and shadows and that kind of thing. And you'll also see a lot of smoke and mirrors used, and by that I mean making the world look richer than it actually is. So a lot of people use a process called billboarding, which is flat images. Don't underestimate the power of flat images in virtual reality. And also they use something called frustum culling, which is, it looks like you're in a big, wide, rich environment, but actually only your cone of vision is being rendered. So there's a lot of cool hints and tips and tricks that developers are using to make these big immersive worlds when actually they're only a fraction of that. Another big thing that they found was useful was to reduce post-processing effects, because they're super costly. And if they were going to do anything costly, they'd use anti-aliasing. So all the jaggedy bits around the shadows and that kind of thing, they found that people in VR, and you sort of have a lot of involuntary head movements that you're not aware of, and the anti-aliasing of those shadows can really, really add to motion sickness. So that was a big one that we found. That was quite a lot of feedback from. And then saying that, narrowing that down further, you'll find that a lot of the platforms from mobile to PlayStation will all have their inherent optimization tweaks. So whatever you're using, make sure that you have some platform-specific tweaks in there too. And like I said, static images work wonders. So motion sickness. I feel like I should mention it again. So it affects a lot of different people in a lot of different ways. And so the testing in user base to find all these different ways is quite extensive. So what we've done is we've put it into a few little stages. So SIGTRAP Games did Sub-Level Zero. I don't know if any of you have played that. It's like a rogue shooter. You're kind of in a spaceship and you're sort of justing all over the place, which sounds like in VR it'd make you super sick. But actually they did a lot of research around it to find what worked best with the players, and they found some really cool stuff. So the first thing that they found was rotation caused more sickness than just linear movement. So whichever axis you were rotating on, that caused far more nausea than if you were just heading in just one direction. And they also found that acceleration caused more nausea than constant movement. So sort of if you're starting off slow and then going really fast while rotating on a axis, then that's just the worst thing in the world, so no barrel rolls. And then secondly, linear movement, as you would guess, causes motion sickness. But again, it's that acceleration rather than constant movement. And as I said, no barrel rolls. That's a mistake. Yeah, I think this seems obvious, but I think it's a good point to make. You'll be surprised how many people haven't tried VR, or that their perceptions of it are completely not what they think it to be. So start the player slow. Maybe put them in an environment that's familiar, or maybe let them get used to VR before you put in any particular game mechanics or that kind of thing. Just let them find their VR legs before you throw them into the game completely. And having a frame of reference is a really cool technique. So like this game, for example, you've always got the helmet on. So you've always got somewhere to visually focus. So if you're feeling a bit nauseous, you've got this sort of security around you. And that really helps to reduce the feeling of nausea and motion sickness. With that then, like with sublevel 0, for example, you're in a spaceship, you're getting shot, you're getting banged around. What they found was that if they shook the frame of reference, so as you can see, this ship is the frame of reference. If they shake the ship rather than the VR camera itself, then that really helps to reduce the feeling of nausea. Because, again, you're keeping that player grounded inside the whole VR world. They have this cage of stability around them. And yeah, so they prefer snap movements. So you might see a lot of VR titles that use the sort of when you're navigating, you rotate and you snap at certain axes to look around. A lot of our developers that we spoke to found that was far preferred rather than you sort of gliding through the world, sort of long, slow movements. Those short, fast ones really helped reduce motion sickness. Like this. I forgot how to give for that. And this is just one that I wanted to add because I thought it was a bit strange. But a lot of virtual reality developers found that players really struggle to have perception of depth in VR. So if they create an experience that means that you need to be able to use that depth for any particular gameplay element or for any sort of skill or goal or achievement, it's actually really hard to train the player to adjust to that depth correctly. And that was something I'd never come across when I was doing my side of development, so I just thought it was really interesting, a really interesting point to just add to this. So the second part is audio. So audio, as we know it, is easy to do in Unity. And so games which aren't virtual reality ones, for example, we still have this idea of spatial audio and being able to place audio in a 3D world. And we have this idea of reverb, so we can make places sound like it's, for example, in a cave or a forest or that kind of thing. And we can also mix audio, be able to set audio and audio listeners so that something sounds far away. We're used to that. We use that in the games that we're using now. But when you introduce virtual reality, it's so much harder to make that audio sound believable. And this is for a few reasons, which I'm just going to go through. So the first couple is to do with the distance between your ears. So if there's a audio source in the virtual world, the time delay between it getting from one of your ears to the other, and also the difference in sound between them as it's moving further away is so much more obvious that it's if it's not right, it's a lot more obvious in virtual reality. People pick it up so much easier, and they get freaked out of where they are or where that sound's meant to be coming from. So the time difference in the level is a big one. And then the other added complexity is in real life, we have a lot of spectral filtering done by our outer ears. So if there's a sound that's behind us in virtual reality, and the spectral filtering isn't done right, again, it can disorientate the player because it just isn't quite right in reality. And it sounds really strange, but it's really true, and it's quite interesting. This is just a diagram I put in. I don't know why. So yes, this just shows what I've just said about how you sort of have direct sound, but then you have this sort of reflected sound which reacts to the environment. So reverberation, if you're in a carpeted room, it will sound different as if you're in a cave, and that kind of thing. And also from all different angles. It's just a diagram to illustrate that. So the good news is that a lot of plugins for existing engines already have all this built in. So they already have elements in their SDKs which do spectral filtering and which do this interaural distance and volume, which is really cool. And they also have reverberation parameters in there too. I think the Google Google VR SDK definitely has all these elements. And then for the added optimization, they usually do the audio on a separate thread. So all your audio is being done separate from your sort of, separate from the rest of the project. So it's just easy to sort of optimize the audio side of things, which is super cool. There's a lot of work that's gone into that. So yeah, the Google VR SDK for Daydream. So just a few hints and tips if you are going to be using SDKs in your virtual reality development then, that already do all these fancy tricks. Don't use any sort of pre-built reverb in there. Don't put anything in there that already makes it echo like it's in a cave or dampen like it's in a forest. Just leave the sound raw for the SDK to do its magic. And this again sounds obvious, but use recognizable sounds. At least at first, to ground the player in the experience. After they're sort of grounded, you can start doing more creepy things. I don't know if any of you have played a game called Monstrum that Junkfish did. So you're sort of in an abandoned ship and you're being hunted by a monster, and it's in virtual reality. And at first they start off with a monster that's stalking you and it's big heavy footsteps and heavy breathing, so you kind of get a sense that you're in trouble. And then as you get used to that cycle of like hiding and fear and what's going on, then they started introducing more creepy sounds that they'd synthesized themselves, and the player was already grounded. They found if they did it the other way, the player was like, well, what's that? Where's it coming from? What's it meant to be? So using recognizable sounds, at least at the start, is a good way to get audio, the most out of audio. And as I was saying earlier about the spectral filtering, that of what our outer ears filters out, what developers found was if they animated the audio source, it really helped the SDK to do that spectral filtering to a higher degree. So just moving the source around. Repeating the sound, seems obvious. And use complex sounds. So by that I mean not using sounds that are too quiet, and not using like simple sounds like faint dings or dongs, and also having lots of frequencies in one sound, because you'll find if it's got, the SDK will have more to play with. So the way that someone explained this to me was that if you apply a filter to a black image, then it won't really do much. Whereas if you apply a filter to an image that's got lots of different colours and objects in it, then you'll get a lot more of a richer output from it. And it's the same when using audio with the SDKs. So the last little part is on the input side of things. So a lot of the sort of mobile side of virtual reality use this gaze input. So it's the most basic form of input. It's very easy to implement, and it applies across all virtual reality. So you'll see a lot of mobile VR using this idea of gaze. And sometimes it's only the choice, such as with Google Cardboard, although you have got the little button. So again, this idea of interactivity and feedback, you can see here that just by gazing at the balloon, you get this instant feedback of the reticule changing size and the colour changing. And this is a really simple example of gaze. But actually, if it's used well, it's super powerful. So have any of you played The London Heist? It was a PlayStation Worlds title. Yep. So in that, you're sort of being interrogated by this gangster. And you can sort of look around the room. And if you look over to the exit sign, he acknowledges that. And he's like, oh, I don't think you'll escape, or something like that. And that sounds really simple, but it's actually a really intuitive way of using gaze to be able to ground the person in that virtual reality world, and for it to be able to be, that's like heightening that interaction. It's instant feedback from just using a simple gaze input. And this is just another example of gaze aiming for the mobile side of things. And also, I say don't underestimate it, because the gaze input is used a lot for being accessible to people who want to play games who have disabilities. So Special Effect had a really cool football game that was completely controlled by gaze. And so, yeah, it's super powerful. Even though it's very simple, it's super powerful. The next step up is motion controls. So things like the Google Daydream controller and the PlayStation Move controller, you have accelerometers in there and gyroscopes, and that when you use these things together, you can actually make pretty cool little experiences. So there's no positional tracking in this game at all. It's just completely using the accelerometer for the swing and the gyroscope for the orientation of the blade. So you can do quite a lot with what the more basic side of input gives you. And then we go on to the more in-depth sort of hand tracking side of things with the Oculus, where we can do hand gestures and that kind of stuff. So it's just that higher level of high-level fidelity experiences. And if you are wanting to look at great examples of user input in virtual reality using the hand tracking, I really recommend Newton VR. You can get it on GitHub. And this is a collection of mechanics that you can use, such as opening doors, lifting lids, placing objects. It's a lot of really intuitive little examples that show you what you can do with the input controllers. It's really nice. And then I just wanted to put this in because I love it. So Fantastic Contraption has this idea of physical inventories. So instead of like an inventory coming down and saying, hey, do you want to use this? Everything is inbuilt in the world, so it never detracts from the experience. So this is your tool belt, kind of. So you have this cat, and then you can pick what you want from the cat that you want to use, and then instead of pressing a button to close your inventory, you can just throw the cat away. And like, I'm not in the business of throwing cats, but I just think that's great. I think that's really nice. It just doesn't detract anything from the game. You can just pick up, take what you want, and then discard it. It's just really nice. So movement then, a big challenge in virtual reality. And this was these are a few examples of what we found our developers using. So the first is what I was saying earlier about clicking into space, clicking into the rotation of which way you want to face, and then selecting a button to say where in that world you want to then teleport. So it's sort of like a fade to black, you're in that, you move, fade out of black, and you're where you'd selected to be at that orientation. So it's just a really nice way of completely having no movement, so no chance of motion sickness. Then there's walking on the spot, and there's actually like a virtual reality treadmill called Virtuix Omni that's in development. I'm not sure what any sort of release cycles for it are, but yeah, this sort of supports this idea of walking on the spot within the environment. Sort of the opposite of that is the idea that in-game you can freeze the world and then turn around in real space, set the game going again, carrying on in the direction. So it's sort of like the inverse of Virtuix Omni. But people found that works quite well, especially with the Vive. And then I've only seen this used once, but this is the Holosphere. So you kind of grab the world and pull it towards you. It works really nice, but I've only ever seen it in this one game, Fuxius. It's pretty cool. And then there's the idea, of using movement in game as a game mechanic. So this is a game called Budget Cuts. And so in this, you sort of fire into the world. It's sort of like the reorientation kind of thing. You point in the world where you want to be, but the added bonus of it is that the world kind of disappears around you and then engulfs you. So it's like you're going through a portal. And it's just really nice. It's just a really nice way of sort of putting it into the game as a mechanic rather than just a simple fade to black and teleport. And then there's making movement in the game design itself. So this is a game called Unseen Diplomacy by Triangular Pixels. And so in this, the game was designed that you are constantly walking around and going back on yourself. But the level itself is on multiple floors and you're going through air vents. So it's never like you're retreading old ground. So it's like completely inherent in the design. It's really clever. And I think they call it redirected walking. So, yeah. So the future then of virtual reality and interactivity. I don't know. Can I say that? So yeah, I think the point of this talk and the reason that I do it is because we love getting feedback from our user base, and we love sharing it, because that's how we innovate, and that's how we make the experiences that we're making better. And so the point of this talk is to give you ideas to take away and put in your own experiences and innovate and make something that suits the experience you're making. So yeah, thank you for having me, and I hope it's been helpful. If you want any further information, like about any Unity resources for virtual reality or anything to do with virtual reality, you can tweet me or you can pop me an email. I'm always happy to help. But thank you for coming, and enjoy the rest of Norwich Game Festival, because there's loads going on. So thank you. Yes.